Hi, welcome to Cafe 229. Today, we're very happy to have Sensei Koshin. He is the founder and president of New York Zen Center for Contemplative Care. Wonderful place, wonderful venue. I'm very happy to be here. And thank you, Sensei, for inviting me.
Thank you.
So, Sensei, since some of our audience do not know much about you and your center, would you want to give a brief introduction?
Yes, so happy to be here with all of you and happy to be with you. And so here we are in the New York Zen Center for Contemplative Care, which I co-founded with my partner, Chodo Sensei, who is also a Zen teacher. This center was really built to be a place of three things. One of Zen practice, another of ongoing learning, and the third is direct care. And so for us, those are the three pillars of our organization, and we really felt that there were enough Zen centers in the world, but we really built this place with the idea of the Japanese countryside temple. When we visit a traditional Japanese temple in the countryside, which was from our tradition, which comes directly from Japan, you see like a school attached to the temple, or a dentist's office, or a medical clinic. And so it's this real integration. And like the shoji screens we have here, that just you open a shoji screen and there's a dentist's office. You open the shoji screen and there's a clinic. You open a shoji screen and there's a kindergarten. And so we thought, like, that's so wonderful to feel that if we're going to serve the community, we have to include everybody. And so we were very clear about when we founded this place together to bring that heart of service into our sitting, into our practice, and how are we taking care of our neighborhood? How are we taking care now, in this time of COVID, our global neighborhood? How do we really think about how we participate in a dynamic way with a loving, compassionate heart? And so we've grown from that initial seed into this home here.
Yeah, wonderful, wonderful. I mean, when I walk into your Zendo, I already get this excitement. It's like, wow, it's this urban setting at downtown New York, and then what a pleasant surprise when I come in. I see the cushion, I see the Buddha statue, I feel the calmness. And I really agree very much. It's like, sometimes people think Zen is just about sitting, like for people who don't know, but it's really about relationship and connection. So the fact that you're having your Zendo in this busy urban area means very much, because you really bring this connectedness to your neighborhood.
Yeah, for us, exactly. The intimacy is the most important part, relationship, and how we are intimate with our lives. So, there's a wonderful teacher named Kobo Daishi who continues to inspire me today. And, he said the depth of one's practice can be measured by how you're serving others. So. Wow. Really seeing, it's nice to say, well, like, I've had all these special experiences, or I'm enlightened, or whatever that is, but how are you serving? How are you participating in the world? And that's one of the things that I see as this beautiful connection between Tzu Chi Foundation and the New York Zen Center for Contemplative Care, is this shared understanding that we must serve the world.
Yes.
We must participate and really think about the dynamic capacity that our meditation practice brings, so that we can be more in relationship with the suffering and the joys of the world.
Yes, I thank you very much for bringing up Tzu Chi Foundation. Yes, I believe both organizations have very similar missions, which is really compassion and care in action. So one of your important pillars, direct care. Now, just curious, how do you introduce Zen to your neighbors? Because I assume a lot of your neighbors do not know anything about this Eastern practice. So how do you attract them to this place?
By listening to the ambulance.
By listening to the ambulance. Yes.
But actually, one of the things that's so interesting about this place is that we are on a big thoroughfare. And so we hear these sounds all the time. In some places, in some monasteries, they have a mindfulness bell. And for us, we have ambulances and fire trucks. And I always feel a great tenderness towards those sounds because there's someone in the back of that ambulance. And their life might be hanging by a thread. And whether that ambulance gets ahead and gets to go where the person needs the help they need. And so actually that's part of how we begin our work here at the Zen Center, is by listening to what's actually happening. And during COVID, one of the things that we've wanted to do for many years is we've been working with the city council. And just here in Chelsea, in this one neighborhood, there are 17,000 adults over 70 living alone.
Wow.
And so one of the things that we've done is to show up for them, right? And working with the city council and other agencies to provide that extra layer of spiritual and emotional support. So letting them know that we are here to provide and to partner with them, with these seniors. Because we really also see the work as not caregiving, but care partnering. And so really looking at how can we partner together? So we're not there to teach you about Zen, but we're there to listen to you, like listening to the ambulance. To actually be really curious about what makes you you. And where is your sense of agency? Where is your sense of meaning and connection? And one of the things that we did just a year ago, we wrapped this research with UMass Boston, where we actually worked with a nursing facility and providing 80 hours of care on each of these floors, and had control floors, and as well as, so we knew we wanted to do one thing, was to provide direct care to folks, but we also said we have to think about the whole system. And so all the care providers, what we now know are called frontline workers. But it was from the janitors to the administrators, the doctors, and the social workers, and the nutritionists, everyone together learning this, what we call contemplative orientation to resilience, which is our training for healthcare providers, which is grounded in the Four Noble Truths.
Wow.
And so really looking at suffering and how do we together move through those truths so that we can be on the path together. And it was wonderful because we're coming from a Zen perspective and not pretending we're not. And yet most of the people, I would say maybe none of the people, were Zen practitioners. And yet they were able to get deeper into their own faith and their own tradition, whether it's Baptist or Catholic or Jewish or Muslim or whatever that is, using these teachings on suffering, on grasping, on how do we shift, and how do we walk the path. And so it was a really beautiful study. And because again, it kind of goes back to your question, well, are you teaching people about Zen? yes, and meeting them right where they are in their lives. So did they all begin to meditate? Yes. Would any of them identify as Zen people? No. But there was something about the tradition and the Buddhist tradition that was super helpful. And it's one of the reasons why the New York Zen Center is not a religious organization. We're an educational nonprofit organization.
Makes sense.
And because we really see that this is, in many ways, like the Buddha is often talked about as the great physician.
Yes.
And also, he was a great pedagogical guy. So he understood how to teach and make things accessible, no matter what your caste, no matter what your gender or orientation is, that he was open to realizing that the teachings of liberation are available to everybody. So I feel in many ways that's what we bring to our neighbors.
Right.
That these teachings, and not trying to mask them as something else, but and be curious about what is important for them.
I think one word you mentioned that hit me is really not just caretaking, but care partnering. I think that's a very important idea, is that we're fellow travelers in life, that we offer what we know from the Buddhist tradition that can be very useful for people who are struggling. And Buddha is not Buddhist, right? I mean, that's it's a common saying, is Buddha's only interested in offering ways to help people dealing with the challenges and difficulties. So it sounds like your audience, or not the audience, but the people who you are able to help are one population is people who are really lonely, right? Because you talk about your neighborhood has like many elderlies who are living alone. That's a tough sort of existential crisis for them, because to live alone, and even to maybe die alone, is a very hard process for most of us,
especially if you don't want to die alone.
Well, yeah, I'm not sure anyone want to die alone. Yes. So I think it seems like you're helping the elderly, you're also helping the frontline workers and the healthcare workers, which are all dealing with something. I guess they all facing the similar existential issues, right? in some way. So can you tell us a little bit of stories on what you have seen, what you have heard when you work with these frontline workers, when you work with the doctors? What have you observed from them? Like, what have they learned from you that was helpful for them?
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you a couple stories. And one is Chodo and myself led a training, the first training in contemplative orientation to resilience, for a group of attending physicians. And also there were some residents and fellows. And so they were all doctors. And we, for years, have been very concerned about doctors. And we teach across the United States and Japan. Actually, we're about to go to China to teach also in China, but then COVID hit.
Oh, too bad.
Yeah, and we still would love to go. And but we wanted to bring together these teachings because we're concerned about doctors, because everywhere we go, there's a similar problem that doctoring is one of the most unhealthy professions there is in the globe. There's the highest rates of death by suicide. There's the highest rates of divorce, of drug and alcohol addiction, and they're in trouble.
Doctors?
Yes. Yes.
Very odd, right?
It's very poignant.
Yeah.
So there's this setup, in a way, of the doctor being so, at this level that is almost impossible to achieve. and they're not taught in medical school. They're taught about basically being like the almost God-like caregiver. So like they are all powerful,
Right.
and are taught that. And the rest of the allied professions are taught that too, so like deferring to the doctor.
Right.
And so they're quite isolated. So even before coronavirus, there was this pandemic of social isolation that we've been very concerned about. And so we began this training for these doctors to really address that, and to really address that in medical school, they are not taught to have difficult conversations. They're not taught to, or they're taught to be the God caregiver. And so,
Right.
as we were saying, that, we even are moving away from that even word, because it's just too depleting. If you just give and give and give, there's no generosity of giving and receiving equally.
Right.
And so that's one of the principles of our training, is that giving and receiving equally. If you're not nourishing yourself, then what you're bringing to the bedside or the clinic is a depletion.
Right.
And just feeling like you have to keep giving. And so what happened, one story that really comes to mind for me, most poignant, is a OBGYN physician, and she was rather bedraggled and really burnt out. And also we refer to that as empathy fatigue.
Right.
Because for us, compassion, and we were just talking about the beautiful work of Tzu Chi about really focusing on compassion, which is what you do with empathy. But very often people are not taught what to do with their feeling. So what happened for her, and she had a long, decades-long meditation practice. And but she didn't know how to bring it together. And so she even stopped looking at what she discovered in one of our first times together, was that she had stopped looking at her patients in the eye about 20 years ago.
Stop looking at the patient's eye 20 years ago.
Yeah.
Wow, that's profound.
Yes, and it was like right after she finished residency and she was beginning her work as an OBGYN doctor, and she was never taught. She had to give two parents news that was very difficult about their baby. And she realized that she was not prepared to do that, or trained to do that.
Right.
To have really difficult and what we would call loving and compassionate conversations. And so she started to turn away, right? And so part of the orientation of our training is, how do you turn towards what's difficult? How do you turn towards your own suffering and struggle, awkwardness, discomfort, whatever that is, so that you can participate in a different way? And what began to happen over the weeks of the training was that she began, after all these years, to look at her patients again.
Wow.
But really, while holding the softness in her belly that she learns in her meditation practice and cultivates in her meditation practice, and to also realize that, this could be a compassion practice, including myself. And she, like many people that we encounter, was in the first time was like, I'm not good at my self-care. That's a very popular expression now in healthcare, self-care. So like you go do your self-care and, you know, go for a walk or go do whatever it is.
Right.
So again, it's this splitting apart. It's like caregiver.
Mm-hmm.
It's these words that are so dualistic, right? And so for us, it's about learning to care is one thing, which means to care for your relationships with your family, with your friends, with your work colleagues. So really learning how to participate in a new way. And so it was just beautiful to see her saying, wow, I had no idea that this subtle and not subtle shift in my attention, both to my lower belly and to actually just look at someone and to feel discomfort and not turn away, could change my life. And these things are easy to say.
Sure.
And take a lifetime to practice.
I think that sounds, this story is very, very symbolic because I think her story really, not just her story, but represent many frontline worker, caregivers' story. I think we all at some point in our life will need to be a caregiver for someone or somebody. And sometimes it is very difficult to really face towards suffering and distress, especially if it's our loved one in front of us. So I think her story really is symbolic in the sense that how sometimes we can become very fatigued in giving, right? Compassion fatigue is a real challenge. I think including C.A.F.E Foundation, we have a lot of volunteers, but sometimes we only know how to provide caring, but forget to care about ourselves. So one thing I always like to remind myself sometimes is like we say we deliver all sentient beings, but sometimes people just, all sentient beings except me.
It's a very popular problem.
Yeah, it's very, very odd.
Yeah.
Now, I also wonder, since you are clinically trained as a therapist, as Jungian therapist, how do your Jungian approach help you to deal with the same issue, existential issue that people may need to face? Confronting, distress, suffering, and death and dying.
Yeah. I think that my training as a Jungian and my practice as a Jungian psychotherapist is one of the aspects that nourishes me, because for me, one of the main things about Jungian work is it's deeply imaginative, and it's also, for me, it feels, in my interpretation of it is deeply Buddhist too, because it is not solely interested in the small self. It's interested in how I'm having experiences that are also collective experiences. So it's not, and it supports us really understanding and experiencing ourselves, for example, anger or whatever that is. Oh, I'm having my experience of anger, but beings throughout time have had anger. Or, people are struggling with compassion. There are many beautiful stories from the Buddhist tradition of his students and himself struggling with compassion. Oh, it's like allowing ourselves, actually, one of the main things I see Jungian work about is it's joining the collective.
Beautifully, beautifully put.
Right? So that it's like joining the Sangha, but throughout space and time.
Okay.
You know, how beings have been bonking each other over the head because they were different for at least 40,000 years. Oh, so my, agitation around difference or not feeling appreciated or feeling discriminated against is not new. And so how do we hold both our personal experience of something and the collective together? So equally. And so not bypassing our personal experience, but really seeing like, yeah, I'm having my experience of whatever that is. You know, it reminds me of a dear friend of mine, and, when she was working with her brother who was dying, and she realized that, wow, I'd never been with someone who was dying before. And then she realized, wait a second, human beings have been caring for dying people for at least 40,000 years.
Supposedly, right?
In different ways.
Right.
In good ways and strange ways, and just like they're doing now. And she said, oh, so if I can just tap into that and just rest in that we've been doing this for a long time, her fear of doing it right became softer.
She's less harder on herself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And realized like, oh, I can join this collective energy of like all these people who have been also had their first experience with a death. With a loved one. Yeah.
Not easy. But one thing I think I hear what you're saying is that both Jungian and Zen teaching is really inviting us to look deeply into the connectedness that we have. My suffering is not just my suffering, but it's related and connected to generations of suffering. And my suffering is not unique in any other way, just like your suffering is not unique in any other way. And maybe my suffering, your suffering are really related in some way or connected. So it's really inviting us to be more closer to each other in some.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I feel like actually it's similar to like New York Zen Center and Tzu Chi Foundation. Right? It's like we could say, oh, like they seem so different, but there are commonalities about compassion. But actually, both of us have a shared lineage.
Right, correct.
That actually is exactly the same.
Well, we both are all really have the same mission, same goal, same idea.
And root teacher.
Same teacher.
Old Shakya.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's correct. And I think our old teacher do invite us to sort of walk towards suffering, which is the first noble truth that you're teaching the first responders and doctors and nurses to really look deeper into our suffering. Now, I think the theme for many of us, the theme of many of our challenges are really a lot to do with losing our loved one or losing something we like, or change. That's a nicer way of saying that, change. But to be more blunt about it is we will be gone one day. So
We'll be dead.
We will be dead. Right? And your Zen Center, I think you're the really, are you only the only Zen Center that's focusing on contemplative care or palliative care in New York City?
In New York City.
In New York City, right? I was because I don't recall other Zen Center that's focusing on palliative care, for example. So what is a good lesson for all of us that we can learn from death and dying? Like, what have you learned by working with people, patient that may be gonna only have 3 months to live, or doctors who've been seeing all these issues? Like, what is one lesson you have learned from them?
I would say the one lesson I've learned if I distill it, there was a woman named Rose Tisnato that Chodo and I work with and had the pleasure to partner with in her dying. And she was at a cancer hospital, and then they couldn't do anything more for her because she was dying. But even that expression is so interesting. Like, we can't do anything more for you because you're dying. It's like, well, she said, you can do something. You can be kind.
That is so important.
Yeah, so it's so interesting, like our medicalized model, like, oh, we can't do anything more for you. It's like, that's a great lie. But it was so great, so she moved into hospice, and she was always a very clear and unusual person. And for me, one of the things she said actually to Chodo that really, to me, is a great lesson she said, just promise me you won't hold back. So for me, that continues to be a really poignant message. It reminds me of what Ehe Dogen, the founder of our school, said, when he said, don't squander your life. This is it. Our life is continuously decreasing. We only have a certain amount of breaths, a certain amount of days we'll wake up. We'll only wash a certain amount of dishes.
Right.
And so not holding back for me is the consistent regret of the dying is that they feel, what did I do with my time? How is it that I didn't actually live what I say I value most? How strange that I was afraid, I was nervous, I hesitated. And what was that all about? So to me, the great lesson is really about living. Consistently, the message is, how are you living? What are you doing with your life?
Yeah.
And how can you participate in an engaged, joyful, and heartbreaking way? Yeah.
I think we should name our episode as Don't Hold Back. I think that is a very profound message, because that is probably, I think there's a saying, people who don't live well do not die well. And I think there's some profound wisdom behind. In fact, our founder, Master Jungian, also said that the purpose of life is not the length, but it's width and thickness. Like, how do you make life interesting with the time you have? So one thing that we always tell our volunteers very much is the preciousness of time. It is, and how do we want to make good use of that time is so important. So I'm very happy to hear you really sharing the same kind of lesson that Buddha has been teaching us. Right? I mean, impermanence, the lesson of impermanence.
And the joy of impermanence, actually.
Joy of impermanence.
Knowing that it's always running out, and that means, wow, I can really be here. This makes life so precious.
Right.
To me, the impermanence is joyful. Like, wow, we have like really this moment.
Right. And it's the impermanence that makes this moment so fresh, right? So fresh. It's like sometimes we do thought experiment of my students. So what happened if you could live forever Or actually, I give them another one. What happens if you're gonna date the same person forever and ever and ever, and nothing changes? How would you feel? And then, of course, they start like, well, maybe that doesn't feel as good as it should be. But if you only have 3 months to live, how would you feel about a relationship? They actually take every moment more seriously. So I think when you work with people who are dealing with the issues of death and dying, they really help all of us to be more mindful and aware that time is limited.
Yeah.
Right? Such an important lesson to have for all of us. It's very, 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 very profound. Yeah. Now, regarding, I know you just mentioned also that sometimes when people only have limited time to deal with, and when they're with terminal illness, often we feel that there's nothing we can do. Actually, this reminds me of some of the relief work, like Tzu Chi Foundation does relief work. So there are times I get to go to do disaster relief, and then you're meeting people that you literally have very little you can say to make them feel better. I mean, I went to earthquake, and I remember this very much. We had one father who lost his son during the earthquake, but he didn't lose him right away. His son was still in the rubble, and he was trying to get the son out, and he couldn't, and there's no help. And his father, and the father was a doctor, and the last words son said to the father was, my father is a doctor who's helping everyone, but unfortunately he cannot help me. And that was like the last word the son said to the father. So when the father shared the story to the volunteers, and I think majority of us really don't know what to say when people are in such a distress, such a pain. I mean, so I think what you just shared is very important. We don't need to always say something. In fact, sometimes the more you say, the worse it gets. Literally, I think we all have this need to like say something. Right? But sometimes the best thing to do is just to be kind and be the bear witness of what happened.
Right. And to be willing to feel his sorrow.
Right.
To feel his devastation. It reminds me, there's a wonderful poem by a poet named Lucille Clifton where she runs into this woman on the street and who has become homeless and is a wreck. And she said, but what I can do for you is stand up. And I can, basically what she's saying is, I can be here. I can see you, feel you, and I know I can't change you, I can't fix you. And the help that I can offer is that I can see you and feel you. You know, so often, you know, in particular the last year, we've had so much, we've had bereavement groups. Normally we have one a season. And now we have 3 every 8 weeks. And there are people actually we've actually had people from Taiwan and, you know, and Australia, from every continent, come to these bereavement groups, grieving together. And very often in this contemplative approach to bereavement, there's not much to say, but to give the space so that people can just feel sorrowful, to feel devastated, to feel ripped open, whatever that is. and just to be able to feel it and to be with it and to be curious about it and to be loving, kind, and compassionate without trying to like make them feel good.
I think that's very important. Sometimes we try to make others feel good more for ourselves than
Because
for
we're
others.
uncomfortable.
Yes.
Yeah, like I want you to feel like, oh, it'll get better.
Right.
You know, and many people come to our bereavement work because their friends and family and sometimes Buddhist communities, people don't know what to say. So they say, oh, it'll get better, or, you know, we're going to get through this. Or try smiling, you know, and different things like that. And when, you know, sometimes like that will come in its own time, but often what people need is just the space to mourn, to grieve, which is just so human. And that's actually not even human. It's mammalian. It means that we're a mammal. Actually, animals grieve.
They do that.
Yeah.
Just to be there. Yeah, just to be there. You know, it's, I think to be the bear witness, to be there for someone who's suffering is helping that person to really reveal their own intrinsic resiliency that we all have. So I think that's one great lesson we can really learn from you is how we can just be with someone and to feel the pain with them. That's one of the best things we can do for people when they're suffering. Yeah. So our time is almost up for our interview. It's such a wonderful way to get to meet you. I mean, I never met you before, so I'm so happy to really have a nice conversation with you. Any final words you want to say to our audience?
It's a joy to be with you, and life is precious, so don't hold back. And actually, I would like to end with a traditional chant, if that's okay. So in Zen centers around the world, in our tradition, we end the evenings with this poem from Ehe Dogen. Let me respectfully remind you, life and death are of supreme importance. Time swiftly passes by and opportunities are lost. On this night, the days of our life are decreased by one. Each of us must strive to awaken. Take heed. Do not squander your life. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sensei Koshin.